Chapter 30 Mirror Universe. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Mirror Universe. Currency. Jake's mind was completely transfixed on these two notions. Using the ether in the form of currency, he could understand it. The problem was, it only worked in the form of a wire transfer. On a galactic scale, the ether didn't seem to have a cash version. You're wrong, there is. She countered, reading his mind. Any crystal structure can contain a fixed amount of ether if properly processed. Usually processed diamond is used to contain pure or encoded ether. Diamond on a cosmic scale is not a rare commodity, since any advanced civilization can make it from carbon, which is extremely abundant. The crystals are then charged and uniformly cut to produce a standardized currency. These ether coins can be used for all kinds of transactions, used directly or fed to the Oracle device to recharge its batteries. What is the value of conventional resources, such as metals, food or gems compared to ether? It depends, it's very contextual. Answered she, seeming to think about the question for once. The mirror universe works differently than the dark universe your planet is in. But when it comes to economics, the same rules apply everywhere, namely supply and demand. However, the ether is the resource and currency with the highest purchasing power. After all, ether gives power to whoever possesses it. With power, you can obtain most basic resources on your own. It is also the only currency recognized by the Oracle system stores. You'll understand better then why the prices are relative. Jake didn't like she's intentional teasing, but made do with the explanation as best he could. However, there were still a lot of things that needed to be clarified. So what's this mirror universe you're talking about? A parallel universe? Jake queried impatiently. The mirror universe is complicated to explain in detail with your level of authority. It is not a parallel world or a copy of your actual world as the name suggests. Simply put, it is another place, a larger place. The classical universe born out of the Big Bang that you're in, we call it a seed world. These worlds are many and are part of what we call the dark universe in reference to their low concentration of ether. Compared to the mirror universe, these seed worlds are insignificant. When one of them develops sufficiently, they are integrated into the mirror universe. This is a very lengthy process where the density of ether will gradually increase until it reaches such a high concentration that the life forms making up these worlds will sometimes have discovered the mirror universe or the existence of ether on their own. The universe from the Oracle's point of view is a mirror universe plus all these seed worlds. Remember that, it's very important. If our world wasn't to be absorbed into the mirror universe before we discovered the ether for ourselves, I guess we're screwed. Jake sighed, demotivated to the core as never before. The invasion or contamination of a seed world by digesters is indeed an exceptional situation, resulting in the immediate assimilation of those worlds into the mirror universe. She confirmed with her customary detachment. In this case, can we hope to find our Earth identically on the other side? After all, seen like that, it's just an unexpected move, the digesters on top of it. Regretfully, no. Your planet was invaded by the digesters for its ether and life forms, but again I repeat, there weren't enough ether on Earth for you to get their attention. She clarified. This means that there is probably at least one alien species in your seed world that is advanced enough to channel and utilize the ether. Naturally, the concentration of ether will be higher in the solar systems where they live. The sad reality is that the Oracle doesn't go into detail. The moment a digester opens a rift, it means they have the coordinates of this seed world. Digesters rarely attack the more evolved species that lured them there in the first place. These monsters usually attack the more primitive species, which gives them the ability to rapidly increase their strength and ensures their rapid growth away from the Oracle's gaze. Consider that thousands of planets at the very least have been attacked at the same time as the Earth. The bottom line is that a contaminated seed world is considered a single entity. When it is absorbed, it is usually reformed in the mirror universe into one gigantic planet, sometimes more. Gravity there remains normal, despite the enormous mass, by a process that even I don't know. There are probably very few races that know how these planets are put together. It's a technology that only a few chosen ones have access to. Jake didn't believe it himself when he asked that question. Sucking the Earth into small pieces and in an anarchic way, in the middle of other unknown places arbitrarily cut up, didn't make much sense if it was to find their blue planet in perfect condition again. Jake remained silent for a long time after that. It was a lot of shocking information to digest all at once. His conception of the universe and many of his beliefs had just been shattered. And when he discovered that what little he thought he knew was in fact insignificant, it made him feel dizzy, overwhelmed, powerless. At that moment, Jake felt like a man overboard in the middle of a storm, trying in vain to cling to a moldy plank of wood so as not to be swallowed up by the waves. To take his mind off it, he remembered that there were still two functions he hadn't been interested in. Mapping and logging. Compared to compress, encode or ether storage, their role was much more intuitive and obvious to understand. The only thing that bothered him was why the Oracle needed such features. Mapping kept track of all the places he had visited since he owned the Oracle, as well as those he knew about. If you've ever played a strategic warfare game, the dark map at the beginning of a game, which reveals itself as you explore it, was very similar. In a sense, it was a very useful feature, since until proven otherwise, the Oracle's memory was infallible. Testing the function with his mind, he enjoyed observing his apartment in the smallest details, which were fully modeled. The roads he used to take, the sports center, his former workplace, his Uncle Kalen's house, all these places could be mentally revisited as if he was there. Conversely, all the cities, places and towns that the Oracle only knew by name or via the internet were filled in much more summarily. Indeed, the Oracle could connect to any online technology to download the information it needed. And considering the existence of Oracle overseers, some of these devices might be able to retrieve the information obtained by other oracles of lower rank. The last logging function was also obvious. There was now a logbook section among the Oracle features. Everything he experienced second by second was logged there in multiple ways. On the one hand, he could see the movie of his life from the present moment until the Oracle device had merged with his right arm to form a bracelet that could not be removed. On the other hand, the Oracle did a remarkable job of record-keeping on its own, like a master of archives. Jake could see many subsections ranging from the history of his current missions, completed or failed, to what he had eaten lately. It all formed a kind of library of his experiences. This was not necessarily knowledge he possessed, since the Oracle recorded absolutely everything, even what he had not paid any attention to. The future of the Earthlings looked bleak. Now all Jake had to do was figure out how to get more ether and how much time he had left to prepare for the impossible before the true apocalypse would forever change his existence. Chapter 31 Interlude Part 1 You are listening at novelfull.audio. Somewhere in the mirror universe a few months later. The sky was blue, the sun's yellow, the moon's purple. Except for a few details, it felt like we were on Earth. Well, almost. A strange mass was floating in the sky several hundred kilometers above the ground. Surprisingly, oxygen remained plentiful, despite the lack of vegetation. And the temperature was quite mild, notwithstanding the extremely high altitude. On this gigantic floating island, several thousand kilometers in diameter, a flourishing city stood in its center. The city conveyed a feeling of absolute order, which only a city technologically thought out from A to Z could provide. On the other hand, there was also a sense of unspeakable anarchy. Its periphery was almost completely occupied by camps, buildings, military bases and factories of all kinds. What all these structures had in common was that no two were alike. The second thing they had in common was that their inhabitants did not look alike either. Villages made up of wooden huts or tents made of animal skins could be found in abundance. Sometimes the people in these camps looked like humans. Sometimes, on the contrary, they looked like nothing a sane person could imagine. Within all these camps and fortunate bases, a heavily militarized pseudo-city struggled to find its place in the midst of all these alien civilizations. On the roof of one of the function buildings, one could recognize the American flag fluttering lightly in the morning breeze. On other similar buildings, the flags of all nations could be seen. Soldiers from different nations were anxiously patrolling around the electrified fence securing the HQ, the large dark circles under their eyes showing high stress levels and a preponderant lack of sleep. "It's D-Day," sighed an Italian soldier with broken English. "I hope my family is well. Don't tell me about it." To private soldiers like us, they never say anything. Spat out another man, with the Turkish flag printed on his uniform. "I've heard that an Oracle overseer is coming down on Thelma to deliver his verdict and tell us what's in store for us," added another with a more feminine build. From the beginning, the government dealt with locals and representatives of the Oracle on Thelma, but it was mostly robots and AIs with no conscience or ambition. Yes, the first time the government will meet a heavyweight since the invasion of Earth 22 years ago. "I wonder how it's gonna turn out," grumbled a fourth with darker skin, calmly greasing his gun. "Anyway, it means that the planet B842 we're on is nearing the end of its assimilation phase. Given the size of this planet, if you haven't taken your loved ones to safety before, don't expect to see them again in your lifetime. Sorry Ricardo, but if your family's not on Thelma, you're out of luck. Fuck you Icom. I don't need you to get depressed." That kind of talk could be found all over this fortified base. However, that was another thing they had in common with all these aliens. All these life forms were going through the same ordeal. That of seeing their home world, their native planet being randomly decomposed and reassembled to make up this planet B842 around which Thelma Island orbited. If someone foolhardy enough ventured to the edge of this floating island and peered out into the void, he would discover a strange planet resembling a mosaic, and extending continuously at a glance. It was by far the largest planet that all these extraterrestrial races had ever colonized or contemplated. A planet so absurdly huge that gravity should have crushed any living thing that set foot on it. And yet, it was not. To return to the events on Thelma, in its center, futuristic skyscrapers thousands of feet high stood proudly, announcing their supremacy to the rest of the world. Between all these skyscrapers a huge black cube, even more massive than these ones, was slowly levitating above the ground. In front of it a cohort of costumed politicians and heavily armed soldiers were advancing cautiously towards the metal monster, sweating bullets for the upcoming gathering. Among them was the current president of the Earth government, a bald Russian man in his 60s. Other representatives of the main Earth forces escorted him, such as an old Chinese general or a commander of the U.S. Army. Influential businessmen, all of them billionaires, were also accompanying them. When they positioned themselves under the cube, the latter descended abruptly upon them, engulfing them under its mass of darkness. The representatives of the Earth government felt their blood freeze as the darkness covered them, but it did not last. A wink later, they were in the middle of a strange floating platform, with enough chairs to accommodate them all. Once they were all settled, the platform, looking like a flying saucer seen from below, rose quickly to join the thousands of other similar objects floating in a circle around a gigantic podium. Each of these platforms was occupied by different life forms, representatives of their own species. This podium was cylindrical, as high and wide as a 30-story building, and its top was spacious enough to house 2 basketball courts. On this podium, acting as a dais, humanoid aliens in war suits with a murderous look were condescendingly staring at the audience. Their true appearance could not be distinguished under their suits, helmets and armor covering them from head to toe. One thing was certain, however, these guards were not human. Nearly 4 meters high, their torso had 4 arms, one of them holding an energy shield covering 2/3 of their body, while another arm carefully held the pommel of a blade still in its sheath. The other 2 arms were crossed, displaying an undisguised contempt. The silvery metallic suit of unknown material seemed indestructible, all vulnerable points of the anatomy being covered by ornate armor plates. These lines of patterns were composed of thousands of incomprehensible runes, emitting a modest bluish glow. Their helmets vaguely resembled the helmets of the ancient Greek phalanxes, but the space leaving the face visible had been replaced by a kind of opaque black liquid. About 10 minutes after the arrival of the Earth government, one of these guards, the one with a golden pattern on his shoulder pad resembling a ring or bracelet from which a sort of arborescence sprang, made a movement towards the agitated crowd for the first time. "Silence," he bellowed in a voice so low that the cube rattled as if it had just been inserted a huge vibrator. "The Oracle Overseer is coming." Very few people in the audience understood what the threatening alien was saying, but each platform had at least one robot interpreter sent by the Oracle system to translate his words for them. There were automatic translators that could be worn to the ear or integrated directly into their Oracle device, but their cost was unaffordable for these poor people of different species shipped here as a vanguard before the rest of their planet. When the assigned interpreters finished translating the words of the Oracle Guardian, two reactions appeared in the audience. The first paled with terror, while the second trembled with impatience. Naturally, the reaction of the Earthlings was mixed. The old generals were worried, but determined to face the worst, while politicians and investors were optimistic, hoping to do well. The poor Earth president elected for the year, meanwhile, was shitting his pants. New politicians coming to Thelma for the first time were full of expectations, but those like him who had been talking to representatives of the Oracle for years knew there was nothing positive to expect from this meeting. He had experienced first-hand how one of those Oracle Knight squads had effortlessly massacred the digesters, against whom they could do nothing. He remembered how his predecessors had struggled to get a few bracelets, or to negotiate a reprieve for their planet. He remembered how great powers such as the United States, China, and Russia, which were on the brink of World War III, were forced to form a united government and appoint a leader or else be immediately considered too primitive to interact with representatives of the Oracle. To be classified in this category would have been a doom for their planet, since they would have been immediately transported to planet B842, which at the time was much smaller, losing all chances of preparing for the inevitable. On the surface, this would have been advantageous. Planet B842, being smaller and not growing any faster after assimilation of planets occupied by primitive life forms, would have been theirs alone, allowing them 20 years more time than other alien civilizations. The problem was that while the military could handle such a situation, civilians could not. It would have been a hecatomb. What the Oracle system considered to be primitive life forms could be monsters as big as dinosaurs. If you included the digesters spawning incessantly with the higher level of ether, it was just impossible. All alien civilizations smart enough to make that decision had chosen to delay. They used this precious time to develop their elites, create a foothold and learn more. They also used the time to build relationships with different races. The elite soldiers they had sent to planet B842 over the past 22 years had evolved beyond human limits, condensing ether crystals to slowly but surely develop Earth's financial capital in the mirror universe. The problem was that these elites, after a certain point, did not want to contribute any more of their hard-earned ether. After all, the ether was the most valuable resource on B842. Maintaining loyalty and controlling these special troops had become a daily headache for these politicians, having never crossed the shadow of a digester. Using a cube on Thelma, regardless of its size or color, had a cost in ether. Heck, even joining Thelma cost an arm and a leg. Suddenly, a stream of blue light gushed down from the top of the black cube, hitting the podium below like a laser beam wide and dazzling enough to blind the audience, for aliens with eyes, or similar sensory organs, of course. The Oracle Overseer was finally here. Chapter 32 Interlude Part 2 You are listening at novelfull.audio. A few seconds after the pillar of light disappeared, the audience gradually regained its sight. When all the spectators in their stands finally gazed at the creature in the center of the podium, they were speechless. Some of the aliens participating in the meeting had a disconcerting non-humanoid anatomy, but there was a kind of harmony, which gave the feeling that somehow it made sense. The Oracle Overseer was a life form that defied common sense. Far from being a terrifying monster like the Oracle Knights guarding the stage, it was a rachitic creature that confronted them. Barely 2 feet long, the alien was hovering slightly above the ground, sitting in some sort of tiny shuttle chair levitating by some sort of process. The head, barely bigger than a golf ball, and his long neck as thin as a bamboo stem about half the length of his body, gave the impression of looking at a harmless tadpole. The rest of the body, less than a foot long, was hidden under an opaque tunic. The creature's skin was batrachian gray, glossy because of an unidentified viscous substance oozing from its pores. The alien had no eyes, no mouth, no nose, and no ears either. And yet, everyone in that giant amphitheater could feel the creature's piercing gaze, exposing their souls as if no secret could escape it. As for the Earth delegation, the businessmen and enthusiastic politicians had lost some of their magnificence, now shivering as if they had just undressed in the middle of an Arctic blizzard. No one was prepared to such a dominating aura. However, while the aura of the Oracle Overseer was overwhelming, there was no hostility towards them. The latter was content to float calmly in his armchair, his tadpole head undulating calmly from right to left. After a moment that seemed interminable to them, a frail hand, looking like an iguana's paw with 2 extra fingers, pulled itself out of the tunic, waving to get their attention. "Welcome to planet B842. I am Horus, the Oracle Overseer responsible for this planet." The tiny alien introduced himself, his high-pitched voice echoing directly into their minds. The voice seemed to come out of nowhere and everywhere at once. Even more surprisingly, each species present could understand its words without the need for translation. And yet, if anyone had been able to record the sounds emitted by the alien, they would have only obtained strange discordant frequencies, closer to sonar than a human voice. "You all know why I'm here today," Horus stated with a formalism bordering on indifference. He would have given its speech in front of an anthill with exactly the same phlegm. With these few words, he had rekindled the anxieties and fears of all races in the stands. The president of the Earth was more ashen than ever, sweating profusely. "My time is precious to me, so I won't delay any longer. I am here because planet B842 will end its growth phase in a few hours," the Oracle Overseer announced, marking a time of silence to let the audience digest the news. Whispers, clicks, squeaks, chirpings, and vibrations of all kinds began to swarm through the room. Each alien delegation was extremely disturbed by the revelation, sometimes excited, sometimes displaying an expression of desperation. According to their estimates, they should have had a few more weeks or months before the planet B842 stabilized. At least 20% of their home planets were still intact, and while their societies had already degenerated into chaos and anarchy, they still had many things to look forward to, such as transporting food, fuel or weapons to planet B842. Otherwise, all their capital would probably be lost. 2 tanks parked next to each other in a military base on Earth could end up on B842 separated by tens of thousands or even millions of kilometers. As for finding gasoline, no need to dream. A tank in the middle of the wilderness without fuel was no better than a pile of wrecks. Planet B842 had absorbed all the exoplanets of their seed world to form a single gigaplanet. There were billions of such planets at the very least, which made the probability of even running into another human extremely low. The chance of running into other humans wasn't zero, though. The absorption of a seed world was not totally absurd, and usually the pieces of Earth were not too far apart from each other. The problem was that this assimilation was done in the same way as when one picks up Scrabble letters. A piece of land in Japan could end up side by side with a Tunisian supermarket. According to information gathered by Earth Special Forces, there were often at least a dozen alien races sharing their new territory, all of which represented only a tiny part of planet B842. The end of the absorption phase meant the end of their preparations. The few bases on B842 that the Earthlings had consolidated were barely enough to house a few million humans, most of them skilled soldiers and sometimes their families. Many promises had been made to maintain the loyalty of these troops and non-combatant personnel, including guaranteeing the safety of their families and a place for them at one of the bases on B-842. The announcement of the Oracle Overseer rendered their promises null and void. The reason this phase had to be abruptly accelerated is of course because Rank 2 and 3 digesters have begun to appear in your homeworlds and the 10 or 20% of these unassimilated worlds are unable to restrain these monsters. Explained Horus to the outraged crowd in front of him. Their ether concentration is too low, limiting the fighting strength of the lesser species you are. On the contrary, if a low ether concentration limits the number and power of the digesters at birth, they have no impediment to their evolution, as long as they have enough to devour. Your countrymen have become their livestock and this must not be allowed to continue. At least on B-842, the digesters will be stronger, but the ether concentration is also much higher and still rising, as you may have noticed. Indeed, even those old politicians with one foot in the grave, on Thelma for just a few weeks now, were showing strength and stamina worthy of athletes in their 20s. Naturally, they didn't want to go back to Earth, since it meant becoming old fogies again. As for the increasing ether concentration, it was indeed a phenomenon mentioned by their elite on the field. If they didn't know why or how, it was now a well-known fact that the more evolved and concentrated the life forms were, the more ether abounded. 20 years earlier, as on Earth, there were only a few rare digesters LVL-0 spawning from the atmosphere. Today on planet B-842, digesters were at least rank 1 and posed serious problems for their armies, since they could emerge directly in the middle of their base. That won't stop the digesters or the local fauna and flora that has adapted over the past 22 years on B-842 from eliminating your fellow citizens, but at least they will have a chance to fight the rank 0 and 1 digesters that are already rampant. After all, the Oracle is with them. It's up to them to put it to good use. But that's not, alas, the only reason I'm here. Horus warned in a prophetic tone. Now that B-842 is soon stabilized, the countdown to your diplomatic immunity will begin. Neither the Oracle Knights nor I will interfere with your actions on this new planet. You can kill each other, enslave each other, wage war, devour, or fornicate, it matters not to us. However, it also means that we will let the digesters do as they please, letting them proliferate unsupervised. In any case, your diplomatic immunity will end in 5 years. After that, the other planets in System ZZ-831 where B-842 is located will be free to visit you. A deadly silence fell over the audience. Some already intended to exterminate their neighbors, but they were not fooled. If they were invaded by the inhabitants of planets that had been part of the mirror universe much longer than they had, they would be heading for disaster. If you have consulted the catalog in one of the stores associated with the Oracle system, you certainly know that the Oracle does not condemn slavery. In the mirror universe, absolutely everything has a price tag. Right at the end of his sentence, a grotesque form the size of a grown man emerged from the void a few feet above the ground, a rift opening from nothingness allowing the digester to be born. The shapeless mass fell on the podium, twisting for a few moments before taking the shape of a sort of translucent arachnid. Before the trash had even had time to make its first cry, an immeasurable pressure of several hundred tons fell on it, reducing it to pulp. Where her body had been splattered, the ground, made of an alien material, but certainly harder than steel, had sunk several meters. The Earth delegation swallowed their saliva with difficulty as they watched this demonstration of power. This poor digester had picked a very bad time and place to disturb an Oracle Overseer right in the middle of his speech. God rest his soul. It was the first time they had ever empathized with a digester. If by some misfortune, I should intervene to get you out of trouble, as I just did by eradicating this unwelcome digester, know that you become the property of the Oracle system. Every plant, human and animal will be catalogued in our database and available for purchase by anyone who can pay the price in ether. The Oracle Overseer cautioned them in a sinister tone. The Oracle has no need for creatures unable to evolve despite wearing an Oracle device. Of course, there are ways around these rules. and I leave it to you to discover them. I bid you farewell, and please pray that this encounter will be the only one. I hate to go down to these godforsaken places. After that, another pillar of blue light struck the stage, blinding them again. When their eyesight returned, the Oracle Overseer was gone. Chapter 33 Welcome to Planet B842. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Beep beep. A disheveled human form blindly fumbled with one arm over his duvet in search of the screaming alarm. 7:00 a.m. Some time ago, he would have made himself a champion breakfast before going to the gym. But not this time. 3 months had passed since the day he killed his first digester. It was now December and the icy atmosphere had little to do with the temperature. When he had asked she 3 months earlier how to get ether and overcome his physical and mental limitations, the answer had been quite simple. Killing digesters. Problem was, it was easier said than done. His victory over that infernal mouse was more a matter of luck than martial skills. If the rodent had been one tiny bit smarter and more responsive, his corpse would be rotting in that alley instead of that creature. Far from overcoming his fear of the monster, the nightmares full of digesters and rodents of all kinds had started all over again. He quickly realized that killing this mouse hadn't changed anything. He was still the same insecure Jake, inclined to procrastinate. There was one difference though, the urgency to survive. By the next day, he had resumed training and survival lessons, continuing to follow his shadow guide. He had literally become the shadow of his shadow. Who was the shadow of who was open to debate? While he was deadlifting weights in the middle of his training routine, he had asked she a question that had been bugging him since the day before. She, why do I always need to train if the ether can do the same job? Because you don't have any ether. She had taunted him laconically. Oh. Good point. Jake had grunted, feeling ridiculous. There's another reason. I told you the ether was pure energy, but that's a simplified explanation. Think of it more as a catalyst or an amplifier. 1 point of ether in strength won't literally increase your strength by 1 point. I'm not sure I understand. Assuming that the ether ratio on Earth is 10, and your strength is worth 10 points, adding 1 ether point will actually increase your strength to 11. But if your strength is 20, 1 ether point will increase your strength to 22. Your body soaks up ether and makes good use of it, but your body, or matter in general, is still the main vector. The encoded ether at your disposal has no special quality except to bind the ether to the parts of your body that need it. An infinite amount of ether can give infinite energy to a single particle, but that particle needs to exist first. At least, that's all you need to remember for now. She had also advised him to set his stats in ether points rather than physically comparing himself to others of his kind. At first this might be confusing, but he would soon realize why this was preferable. Switching between physical and ether statuses would allow him to keep tabs between his ether levels and the actual level of his body. For example, the human body could hardly exceed 30 points of strength. It was a biological limit. Same for intelligence, the highest IQ recorded was 234 points, or 23.4 points. The good news was that ether and body biology were interacting with some synergy. To gain muscle, for example, the body needed to train hard, sustaining muscle damage. With a proper diet and enough rest, the muscle would be repaired, becoming stronger than it was originally. More ether and vitality, for example, would result in an increased metabolism. As a result, digestion, recovery and muscle synthesis would be faster. It would then be possible to train more often, shortening rest periods. The same was true for the constitution or strength. A better constitution or muscular strength would make it possible to lift heavier and longer, allowing better stimulation. So that's what Jake did. He practiced night and day, forgetting his distress and fears and dedicating himself to his self-development. For the first few weeks, his daily routine remained much the same as the previous month. Then the strange phenomena described by Paul began to visibly affect New Paris. Houses began to disappear, roads became shorter and shorter, and chaos set in. People stopped working, staying shut up at home with their loved ones. At the same time, criminals and delinquents began to proliferate without a sufficient police force to keep them in check. Jake continued to go to the gym and shop for a while, always carrying a gun and a military knife with him. Maybe because he had a different aura after killing a digester or because his physique had become quite fit, no one messed with him. Then the day came when new land came in the way between his home and his gym. In panic, he spent more than 8 hours wandering around with the help of his oracle before finally returning home. After that, he rushed to the nearest supermarket and robbed it by filling a huge shopping cart, before hurrying home. Since then, like everyone else, he had been stuck at home. Jake continued to imitate his shadow guide, practicing and learning at home. The shadow guide showed him how to use every firearm in his possession, how to handle a knife. He practiced all sorts of techniques and movements aimed at vital points. After 2 months, he hardly dared to look out the window anymore. The city of New Paris had become unrecognizable, and apart from a few buildings, he didn't recognize much of anything. Then one morning he realized that a building near his home was 2 stories lower. Another was missing a section. He then realized that even at home, part of his apartment could disappear at any time. Becoming half paranoid, he began to sleep in the living room in the middle of all his food rations, weapons and ammunition. Even Crunch seemed to have understood his master's concerns and began to sleep only on the sofa bed in the living room. Thus Jake and his cat spent the 3rd month together. When Jake woke up this morning, he didn't look like the nerd he was 4 months ago. He was still the same shut-in, but not for the same reasons. His hair needed a good chisel, and his too-week-old beard was also a sign of his slackness. By contrast, no skinny-fat body or acne linked to overindulgence and sedentariness could be seen this time. He was ripped as fuck. More than once in the last month the digesters had climbed the wall of his building, and after killing the 8th one, something had died inside him. As the digesters got bigger and bigger, more deformed and vicious, there was nothing left in him but apathy. When he got out of bed, he knew right away that something was wrong. He got dressed urgently, putting on the clothes he had planned for the situation. He put on khaki military trousers, a black T-shirt, a bullet-proof vest and a thermal jacket. He grabbed his huge backpack, which contained everything he needed to survive comfortably in the wilderness. From a tent to spare clothing, his bag weighed well over 30 kilos. He could not carry all his weapons, but he had a few knives, a long machete, 2 9mm pistols and an assault rifle. Loaded as he was, Jake realized it was ridiculous. He could never take all of this with him. But at least it made him feel safer. Crunch was standing next to him, watching him with his ears down, visibly scared. Jake didn't have a plan for his cat. Even though he had become attached to it after all this time, he couldn't see how to guarantee its survival. After all, it was just a cat. He could only hope that the oracle had a solution to guide pets in such situations. Suddenly, the flash of light that could never be forgotten from 4 months ago struck again. He felt something stirring inside him, as if an entity against which he could do nothing was redefining the very definition of his existence. Then the uneasy feeling disappeared as it had come, giving way to quietude. The black cat also turned his head in all directions, searching in vain for the origin of this quirk. At last, when he regained his sight, Jake took his courage in both hands, and with heavy breathing approached the window. The sight he saw there took his breath away. His apartment was in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by unknown landscapes. Even the other apartments in his building had been sent somewhere else. He didn't live on the ground floor, and yet his apartment was now at ground level. He had left the earth. He was now alone, on his own. "Welcome to planet B842," murmured she, in a soft and compassionate voice. Chapter 34 Let's go for a hike. You are listening at novelfull.audio. Chapter 34. Let us go for a hike. Planet B842, is that where I am? Jake asked with a calmness that surprised even him. Indeed. You're on your own now. Hopefully, there are other humans around, but don't count on it. She cooled his hopes. Jake took a deep breath, packed his things with resolution, then hesitantly opened the front door of his home. It opened directly onto a sand dune. The hallway, the stairs, the doors leading to his neighbors' apartments, everything was gone. The city around him was gone, and if he vaguely recognized a familiar skyscraper in the distance, the similarity stopped there. Half a kilometer radius around the building he was standing on, water, only water. His apartment literally stood on a mound of sand. And beyond that, sand dunes interspersed with fir forest somewhere in between, a snow-covered hill. And at the top of it a vertical ray of blue light linking heaven and earth. Fortunately, the sky remained uniformly blue. He couldn't bear to see a blizzard under such a hot sky. Stretching his muscles tense from all that stress, he congratulated himself for being so well prepared. The main drawback, however, was that he would have to swim out of the island. The water in the micro-lake around him was muddy and smelled of rotting algae. Not really the ideal pool where he was planning to do laps. Luckily his apartment survived in one piece. Simple, yet modern furniture. With his paranoid instincts, he had been prepared for all sorts of situations, including this one. Poking around in one of his closets, he found an inflatable boat he didn't hope to use one day. So a nonchalant Jake inflated his boat by rhythmically pushing the air pump with his foot. After a few minutes a beautiful yellow plastic boat was ready to go out to sea. Or rather, in the mud. He had even planned the paddles. Genius. You're lucky that you're smart, Jake. He congratulated himself, speaking aloud. Don't get too excited. After almost 4 months of taking a path teaching you how to survive, it would have been disappointing otherwise. She rebutted, bringing him down a peg. Before throwing himself into the unknown, Jake checked his status. Species. Homo sapiens, primitive humanoid species, age .25, height. 180 centimeters, weight. 80 kilograms, health. Healthy, strength. 16.3 points / normal male. 10 points. Agility. 14.2 points, normal male. 10 points. Constitution. 16.2 points, normal male. 9 points. Vitality. 16.6 points, normal male. 10 points. Intelligence. 15.1 points, normal male. 10 points. Perception. 10.6 points, normal male. 10 points. Knowledge and skill masteries. Informatics. 76 points, normal human. 8 points. Intermediate, cyber engineering. 51 points, normal human. 1 points. Intermediate, communication. 9 points, normal human. 10 points. Novice. Still a social, but at least you can express yourself properly. Fighting. 32 points, normal people. 5 points. Novice. You know the theory, and fought against a few digesters. Unfortunately, these digesters were too weak and always attacked by surprise. Don't think you're good. You're not. Cooking. 34 points, normal human. 4 points. Novice. Still not a chef, but you can be trusted in the kitchen. Survival. 46 points, normal human. 5 points. Novice. The theory is in your head, all you need is practice. Firearms. 14 points, normal human. 1 points. Novice. At least you won't get hurt. You know the theory, but you have never shot anything, even if you've rehearsed. Edged weapons. 22, normal human. 4 points. Novice. You've been practicing, and you cut up some digesters last month. But it was your brute force that did all the work. His body, tempered by months of intensive training, had nothing in common with his former physique, and his stats reflected this. He was not yet at the level of an Olympic athlete, but he was now undoubtedly in the top 1%. His strength was all-rounded but more on the explosive side. He had gained in flexibility, balance and coordination, but his reaction time hadn't improved much, except for a few reflexes. His intelligence had been plateauing for a while. He was probably not far from his biological limit. Perception was hard to improve, but he still had modest results. With the effect of his diet, his eyesight and hearing were slightly better. How much ether do we have? After 3 months of accumulation, and 8 digesters LVL0, about 4 points. The last 3 were close to rank 1. Replied she, with a formal tone. Jake shivered as he remembered his fight with the last digester. A disgusting, half-plucked raven had hammered his window with his beak until it cracked. Cawing as if he owed him money, the monster had head-butted the crack until its head passed through it. The bird was big and heavy enough to make an eagle jealous. Partially flabbergasted, Jake had fetched his fancy katana in panic, then stroked down with all his might, decapitating the crow in one blow. He had put so much strength into the stroke that the carbon katana had been chipped. Since then, he had been content with his machete and knife. It wasn't as beautiful, but it did the job for a savage like him. Plus it was easy to maintain. He pondered long and hard, weighing the pros and cons before making a decision. He absolutely could not take the risk of venturing into this new world without using all his cards. He would feel terrible if he got munched by a digester or something else because he hadn't used up all his ether points. Well, not really, since he would probably be dead. The main risk at his level was to react too slowly. A fly didn't have any strength or mastery of martial arts, but time went 4 times slower for them. That way, it could easily avoid the fly swatter. Even after all that time working out, his sub-attribute, reaction time, composing intelligence and agility was still at 10 points like any healthy human. Even the greatest martial arts masters had a normal reaction time. What changed was their reflexes. Encodes 2 points of ether agility. Jake ordered confidently. Your wish is my command. She responded, Jake imagining her at that moment taking a cute stand at attention. He immediately felt the difference, as if his whole body had just been rewired, the cable suddenly replaced by fiber optics. He felt suppler, more flexible. The ripples of the mud around him had slowed down, as had his breathing. When he tried to move at his usual pace, he felt additional resistance, as if his muscles had to work harder. They did, because he was actually moving faster. It took him a good half an hour to adjust to these changes. He would probably feel that the people talking to him were slower, but the good news was that at least for the moment he was alone. Testing the buoyancy of his work, he uttered an approving grunt. That would do the trick. Piling up his food, his travel bag, and his weapons, he rowed across the small body of water without haste. His every move was precise and controlled, and even without forcing he swallowed the distance in the blink of an eye. Every now and then the oar would get stuck in the mud or hit something, but he managed to ignore it. At his destination, he landed cautiously so as not to overturn his boat at the last second. The white sand and the few palm trees around him reminded him of the beaches of the Caribbean. The change of scenery caught him off guard, but he did not linger any longer on this incongruity. Everything that had happened to him since waking up was incongruous anyway. Dropping off his supplies from the boat, he formed a mound under the shade at the foot of one of the palm trees, and then recapitulated what he remembered of the landscape he had memorized of the islet. Here the only compass that worked was the oracle. Searching north from the sun, the magnetic field or the stars would be a waste of time. Not only because there were 3 suns, but also because it didn't matter. The surroundings and probably the climate also changed from one area to another. Ideally, all he had to do was to meet the other humans who had been sucked in at the same time as him. Or better yet, those who had arrived before him. Deep down, despite his individualism, he hoped that his family and friends were well. Luckily, there was a direction that was not random. That of the snow-covered hill and its ray of blue light. From his point of view, it was a signal left for him, and he hoped that other humans in the area would think like him. Moreover, the oracle confirmed his choice. He estimated the distance to be about 20 kilometers at the most. That was about 3 hours of brisk walking. 4 or 5 if he took his time. Ignoring the dangers he might face, Jake chose to preserve his endurance. In this case, his pack would already tire him considerably. Something I should be concerned about, Jake asked one last time before setting off. Pay attention to the cubes. She answered in a cryptic tone. Chapter 35. Nice to meet you. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The cubes. Jake repeated stupidly, wondering what a cube could do in a place like this. The cubes, no matter what their color or size, are vital to anyone who wants to thrive here. She clarified. You'll understand when you encounter one. She added. At that moment, Crunch, who was sunbathing in the inflatable boat, suddenly straightened up, its hairs pulled up. Searching for its master, it came to rub Jake's legs while purring, apparently needing to be comforted. Jake, on the other hand, had no one to rub himself with to feel better, except perhaps the palm tree behind him. Bang-bang sounds of gunfire echoed in the distance. With the echo, it was difficult to determine how far away the shot was fired. But it came from the direction of the snow-covered hill with the blue light stream. In another context, he would have fled in the opposite direction, but here it was rather good news. It meant that at least he wasn't the only human being around. He immediately set out to reach the area where the shots were fired. If the persons there turned out to be suspicious, there was nothing hindering him from continuing on his way alone afterwards. Loaded like a mule, he also had to be careful that Crunch didn't lose sight of him. Luckily for him, the cat followed him like a small hound. Once in a while, its highness would stop to urinate against a tree or sniff some feces belonging to who knows what mammal. Thus occupied, he shortened the distance quickly. BL.net. Barely 2 kilometers later, he had to stop when a piercing scream ejected him from his state of concentration. The shrill sound had sent shivers down his spine, an emotion so intense that he had only felt it once before. When he met his first digester. Crouching stealthily in the ferns at the foot of a fir tree, he cautiously laid down his package and clutched the handle of his machete to the point of whitening his phalanges. The ferns in the direction of the noise began to rustle in front of him, then were jostled by an alien form literally scaring him stiff. A humanoid creature more than 2 meters tall with a woody body and gray skin, similar to that of a batrachian, stood in front of him, cackling that same intolerable shrill sound. Its upper limbs were thin and long, ending in fingers similar to blades of liquid silver, changing shape incessantly, sometimes taking the shape of the ferns, sometimes those of claws or hooves. The lower limbs, on the contrary, were muscular and covered with chitin, reminiscent of the legs of an insect. A long tail similar to that of a mouse twice its size, but with a metallic sheen and cutting the bushes behind it as it swayed. As for its head, a tiny skull, comprising a large bulging eye with a slit pupil and a jaw with sharp fangs that seemed to be able to extend infinitely like a python. At times, the eye would glow with a halo of white light. A creature of nightmares. Holy shit. What the hell is this thing? Jake mumbled between his clenched teeth, barely holding back from screaming. A digester rank 2, warned she. Very dangerous for you at your current level. I recommend opening fire immediately. Realizing the cold sweat running down his back, a white anger filled Jake. He was just beginning to overcome his nightmares when an even uglier digester showed up in front of him. All his preparation was dictated only by his instinct for survival and the idea of facing animals or humans similar to those on Earth. He knew nothing about these aliens, and so chose not to paralyze his thinking with unnecessary fear. But this monstrous creature, at least he knew he was no match for it. He knew in his gut that if it realized he was there, his carcass would soon end up in Carpaccio. On the other hand, he had the intimate certainty that escape was impossible. His speed would be useless in the face of such a beast. The only solution was to fight. Overcoming his fear, he clutched his machete even tighter and left his fern hiding place. Upon noticing it, the creature uttered a jubilant howl, as if Christmas had come a month early. Frowning, Jake took the opportunity to also point his semi-automatic pistol at the creature's forehead. The man and the beast stared at each other in the whites of their eyes for a moment that seemed eternal to the young man, and then the calm was broken. The creature roared vindicatively and charged, his liquid fingers taking on the same shape as his machete. Not to be outdone, Jake took a deep breath and pulled the trigger on his gun. The skin on its forehead, which he thought was fragile, only cracked on contact with the 2 bullets that struck its skull. Nevertheless, the violence of the shock caused the creature to waltz backwards, stopping its momentum. For a moment, Jake was surprised by his own precision. The 2 points of ether in agility had improved his reaction time, as well as his coordination, dexterity, and body control. The unexpected consequence was that he suddenly had a deft touch. His first shots had reached the target without a hitch. Renouncing the shot, he took advantage of this respite to rush the monster. A long sharp tail whistled to his left, which he avoided by bending forward without stopping. Then he deflected one of the blades that served as the creature's hand with his machete. Feeling his knuckles crack, he realized that a weaker man would have fractured his wrist trying this maneuver. The creature had incredible strength. He continued his approach and, when he was close enough, leapt with his pistol in hand into the monster's face. He then released the entire magazine after sticking the tip of his gun where the first 2 bullets had cracked the creature's chitinous skin. In an agonizing death rattle, the creature's blades took on the shape of sharp fingers, then squeezed him with all their might, crushing his ribs and slashing him from all sides. Without his Kevlar vest, he would have been long dead by now. Just as stubbornly, Jake flexed his muscles like a madman to resist the pressure and began to strangle the beast, not knowing whether or not the life form needed to breathe. At last, after 2 long infernal minutes, the monster uttered a last death rattle and the halo of white light in its eyes faded away. The pressure of its sharp fingers eased as they liquefied and Jake was finally able to catch his breath. His ribs had held, but numerous cuts covered his body and his torn clothes were now stained with his blood and the silvery blood of his victim. It would take him several days to recover, but at least his movements would not be impeded. A fracture would probably have condemned him to such a place. As for his Kevlar vest, it was good for the trash, but he didn't throw it away. After all, it had saved his life, and however damaged it was, it still provided substantial protection. Slipping on the floor to catch his breath, a luminous glow caught the attention of his eye. A tiny, static flash of pure white had sprouted from the creature's forehead just where he had pierced its skull with his gun. Realizing that he was seeing a manifestation of ether for the first time, he grazed it with his fingertips as he caught his breath. "Don't do that!" she yelled. Too late. Since he never saw ether before, he had never realized compress and encode were not automatic. Immediately, a changed state of consciousness overtook him, and he knew right away that he couldn't turn back. Ceasing to lose himself in useless reflections, he knew instinctively how to absorb this concentrate of ether. Focusing his attention on the foreign energy that was emitting a harmoniously high and low-pitched sound at the same time, the same shrill sound as the creature, but much weaker, resounded in his head. A sudden migraine invaded him, giving him the impression of an overflow passing through an insufficiently wide duct. His own ether and the digesters began to merge, and for a brief moment he felt a feeling of intoxication he never thought possible. The intoxication of life, but also other darker emotions. The urge to devour all creatures, including humans. When memories that were not his own passed through his mind, he realized that these emotions were not his own. They were those of the creature of which he was assimilating the ether and obviously a fraction of its thoughts. This monster was rather stupid, but the bits of memories gave him the feeling that he could control his vital functions much more finely. Perhaps with more memories, he could have figured out how to change the shape of his limbs. Unconsciously, he understood what raw ether like this could do and what he would gain by growing it. Although it was not yet clear in his mind, he understood that it would make him stronger and increase his chances of survival. He also understood that those memories that were not his own would eventually change him deeply if he was not careful. Fortunately, he had only glimpsed a sliver of the creature's thoughts. The creature's mind was simple and primitive, easy to dominate and put into perspective. He didn't know what would happen if the monster had an intelligence superior to his own. When the assimilation of the ether was complete, Jake returned to his usual calm state. He felt pleasantly rested despite his blood loss, a gift from his duel to the death with the monster. A few minutes later, he painfully returned to his pack, grumbling from the pain, then after poking around in it for a while, pulled out a disinfectant solution, bandages, and sterile compresses and began to apply his first aid lessons to patch himself up. An infection far from civilization would significantly reduce his chances of survival. Unfortunately, although his ribs were not broken, they were painful, perhaps cracked. His chances against another monster like this one would be much darker. Damn it, I'm on that damn planet for less than an hour and I'm already in bad shape. Jake sighed as he was taking a bite out of a high-protein bar to recharge his batteries. He didn't even realize at the time that he had just slaughtered without batting an eyebrow a monster that would have filled his nightmares a moment earlier. Chapter 36 I Feel Different. You are listening at novelfull.audio. The battle had been brief but intense and the blood loss was gradually being felt. He calmly chewed on his protein bar, clenching his teeth from time to time, trying to ignore the pain. Luckily, his trusty cat Crunch, who was nowhere in sight at the time of his battle with the digester, came to rub him for comfort. Or not. Instead, Crunch cautiously approached the corpse, then sniffed it carefully. After a few paw strokes to test the temperature, the pet began licking its lips. Is it edible? Jake investigated, not convinced that something like this could taste good. It depends. Once the ether is extracted, it is just dead flesh. But it might not be a carbon-based life form, or it might be poison to species from Earth. Either way, if the cat is tempted, maybe it is safe to eat. You can taste a small amount and check for changes in your health via the oracle. She advised. Jake had forgotten that he could test the effect of an herb, medicine, or novel food simply by looking at the changes in status that it caused. He tended not to pay attention to it, but it gave all kinds of information, from blood pH to hormone levels. I also want to warn you. She resumed with an accusing tone in her voice. Don't ever do what you just did again. Uncompressed ether from a digester corrupts. They don't need to bite you or infect you to make you a digester. Just absorbing their excess ether is enough. Even if you don't become one, you won't be the same. The same goes for other life forms, including humans. Remember my soul briefing. For non-evolved life forms, the soul is not stable after death and dissipates quickly. It's different with the ether. It can hold for a while. Unlike the Earthlings, the etheric code of a digester is very sophisticated, even a rank 2. You have literally absorbed a fraction of a digester's soul. Don't forget that. Your etheric code has already changed. It may seem epic when you put it that way, but absorb the ether from hundreds of chickens and one day you'll wake up believing you're one. She's words gave him a chill. He had learned his lesson. Still, he didn't feel responsible for his mistake. If she had informed him earlier about the risks, or the process for compressing the ether, he would not have acted so rashly. Don't ask me why. I don't know. She apologized, glad she didn't have a flesh and blood body or she would have had a migraine by now. All I can say is that they've activated the ether vision feature, normally only available at authority rank 3. That's why you could see this simplified representation of the ether. So compress and encode, which were automatic until now, have been disabled. You can reactivate them with a single thought. Jake couldn't understand how much of the Oracle's system depended on an AI, and how much depended on the decisions of individuals. Nevertheless, he reactivated both functions. No one knows. But decisions about planets like this are usually made by a single Oracle overseer. They are the Oracle's sycophants, and are usually failures or deserters on the scale of the entire mirror universe. But on the planets under their jurisdiction they are gods. She seemed to have a certain hatred towards these representatives. For an AI who was supposed to have no emotions of her own, it was more than surprising. But it had been a long time since Jake realized that she was much more than that. At least the Oracle Overseer seems fair. Seeing the ether has its advantages. What you did earlier, in moderation, can save your life. She toned down what she said before. In any case, putting his injuries aside, he was in a pretty good mood. His authority level hadn't suddenly jumped to rank 3 just because he had defeated a digester LVL2. According to she, only the murder of the first digester would allow him to pass rank 1 by skipping all other prerequisites. The main reason was because the Oracle distinguished civilians from fighters by this simple feat. The real reason, however, was that killing a digester LVL0 gave between 100 and 500 points. This was enough to fill the 100-point gauge of rank 0. When a level was reached, the excess points were just wasted. Moving up to higher ranks usually required a lot of preparation beforehand. With the 7 digesters he had killed in the last 3 months, he had accumulated about 2,100 points. With the one he had just killed he had 5,200/10,000 points. A digester LVL1 was worth between 500 and 2,000 points, while a LVL2 was worth between 2,000 and 5,000. So the monster he killed was a lightweight. The reason why a digester could be worth as much as a higher-ranked digester was because some of them couldn't evolve, but that didn't stop them from continuing to grow and accumulate ether. It had already been said, but Jake was oddly well. His wounds no longer hurt and he, who an hour earlier was under stress, felt nothing but serenity and slight exhilaration. The sound seemed to resonate more strongly. He could discern more colors, and the air was enriched with new smells. His thoughts were clearer, and despite his potentially cracked ribs, he felt stronger than ever. "There's something wrong," Jake said, frowning, with a slight doubt. "Take a look at your ether status," she hinted. When Jake did what she asked, he was stunned by his new status for a while. His ether, which had been 10 points overall except for a 12 in agility, now looked like this. Ether status. Strength, S. 12 points, agility, A. 13 points, constitution, C. 13 points, vitality, V. 13 points, intelligence, I. 11 points, perception, P. 10.5 points, but why? He stammered, not understanding such a difference. With encode he would have needed 72 ether points to get those statistics. "You have forgotten since it was 3 months ago," she intervened, refreshing his memory. "When the oracle in your bracelet compresses the ether to purify it and make it usable, 95% of the ether is lost. It was a digester LVL2. With compress, you would have gotten 3 or 4 points. This unfortunately has effects that go beyond the ether. Your body should also have benefited, as you can feel it on your mood. The genetic consequences are negligible with such a weak digester, but you must not do it again, for now anyway, it's a blessing. Whatever the consequences, you need to be alive to complain about them." And indeed, when Jake checked his physical status, there were some changes. Strength, S. 19.3, plus 3 points. Agility, A. 15.5, plus 1.3 points, Constitution, C. 19.2, plus 3 points, Vitality, V. 19.6, plus 3 points, Intelligence, I. 16.1, plus 1 points, Perception, P. 11.6, plus 1 points. Fun fact, he was also 1 centimeter taller and 2 kilograms heavier. Ether and body were two different concepts, but their effects were strongly intertwined. With 13 points in ether vitality and constitution, and close to 20 with his flesh body, his effective toughness, stamina and regeneration were now about 3 times those of the average man. Mind-blowing. No wonder his ribs didn't hurt so much anymore. After that, the young man took advantage of his renewed strength to dissect the creature that had nearly ended his life. The Oracle had bombarded him with survival lessons, and it was time to put them into practice. Using his military knife, he methodically cut and studied the monster, while continuing to eat in between moments of hesitation as to what to do next. One would have thought that a normal individual living in a modern society would be nauseous in the face of such carnage, but not Jake. Because he was still in a state of shock, or because of the ether he had absorbed, he was euphoric instead of being nauseated by the butchery around him. In the end, the internal anatomy being very similar to that of any other mammal, despite the blood and silvery flesh, he felt that the beast was surely edible. Taking a bottle and a Tupperware out of the bag, he retrieved a portion of the blood and silvery flesh to test its edibility later. He still tasted the blood from his lips, to get a first idea. A characteristic metallic taste, but also slightly sweet. If he didn't turn in his guts in the next few hours, he could gradually try to consume it. The iron and other nutrients would help him to renew the lost blood more quickly. Anyway, Crunch hadn't waited for him and chewed an unidentified piece of guts a bit further on. Well, he didn't even need to test anymore, he could just watch the cat. So stupid. Leaving the creature's remains to rot in the sun, Jake walked away calmly, but much more scowling than before. He now knew that there were silver monsters lurking around him, and this greatly reduced the chances of meeting other survivors. How many could claim to be as athletic as he was? How many had the presence of mind to carry a weapon when they were teleported here? Just by asking the question aloud, he guessed the answer. Probably not many. And if he looked at those who could use such weapons, the chances of survival were even lower. Walking as cautiously and silently as possible, he swallowed the rest of the distance to reach the snowy hill where the blue light signal attracted him. The transition from a scorching heat to a polar cold was particularly unpleasant, but by clenching his teeth and putting on his jacket and scarf, he quickly regained his tranquility. He climbed slowly up the hill, being wary of sudden changes in the environment. But his distrust was misplaced. He encountered nothing suspicious during the rest of his climb and instead enjoyed his walk in the snow and the icy wind whipping his face. His beard and his neglected mane acted as an excellent thermal insulator. When Jake finally reached the top, a new view opened up for him. The first thing he noticed was the blue light gushing up to the sky from a kind of crater. The snow was flowing back in the opposite direction. The second thing he noticed was a group of humans staring at him in a frightened way. Chapter 37 Aslail Part 1 You are listening at novelfull.audio. The group was a motley crew. 5 men, 6 women, 1 child. One of the men, a rather athletic playboy, was about his height and wore a Colt in his hand. The rest of the group seemed to crowd around him, seeking his protection. And apparently he seemed to be gloating over all this attention. They haven't met a digester LVL2 like me, it seems. From the look on his face, I'd be surprised if this playboy could keep his cool against such a monster. Jake judged, turning his gaze to the other individuals. The child was rather small, about 5.6 years old, and was holding the hand of a woman in her late 40s, who was, he guessed, his mother. Poor thing. One of the men, wearing a $2,000 suit, a 6mm shaved haircut and designer-framed glasses, looked relaxed, as if it was none of his business. As for the other three, they were visibly tense, balding, with dark circles, and were clearly in the category that had chosen to hide without any preparation in the previous months. In other words, weak-minded people who let themselves be guided and paralyzed by their fear. Finally, the 5 young women were all in their 20s, and the oldest was probably no older than him. All pretty, all carefully made up and pleasantly dressed. Probably the procession accompanying and admiring the playboy from some college. Luckily, the playboy and his admirers had managed to stay together when they were brought here. A feat in itself, considering that people who had disappeared a few dozen meters away from his home had not appeared at his side when he arrived in this world. Perhaps they were in the same room or they had gathered together afterwards. After all, he did not know how long these people had been here. Believing that the group was no danger to him, Jake placed his belongings near a rock and leaned against it, before turning his attention to the blue light beam. He was not stupid though. His hand never left his gun handle. Closing his eyes, he watched the sensations in his body. Nothing abnormal. Apart from the cuts, he felt better than ever. Even the pain of his potentially cracked ribs had subsided. The cat was doing well, too, and its fur seemed glossier than usual. According to his status, he was recovering faster than his vitality should allow. Reassured, he pulled the pin out of one of the vials of silvery blood from the creature he had collected and consumed more of it again, this time in larger quantities, but without letting go completely in case the toxicity appeared at higher doses, or if the incubation time was longer. The young women in the other group stared at him in a dazed look when they saw him drink this strange silver liquor. The older woman grabbed her child's hand and stepped back a few steps as she recognized the substance. Surprised at their reaction, Jake was able to confirm that their group may have had some unexpected circumstances before arriving here. Remembering the sounds of gunfire earlier, he made the association with the Playboy's Colt. Digester LVL-1 at most. He estimated. According to his theory, the creature they faced was probably younger and weaker than the one he shot on the way, or their group was initially larger, and some had been sacrificed to allow the others to survive. Or the Playboy was a much better shooter than he thought. But the terrified expression and pale complexion of the members of this group rather corroborated the second hypothesis. Considering that, in the end, information was life, he suddenly got up to walk with a measured pace towards the other group. Seeing him approaching, women and men alike squeezed behind the Playboy, or rather his Colt. Only the businessman with glasses kept his relaxed appearance. Just as Jake was about to break the ice, the blue light beam intensified and the sound of thunder resounded. Stopping his movements, he and the other group turned their attention to the light, and suddenly a human-like individual came out of the blue light. Resembling, because he was clearly humanoid, but different from a human too. First, he was quite tall. Almost 2.40 m high. His hair was silvery like the blood of the creature he had killed. From his silvery eyes, a white blue incandescent light pulsed. His golden skin was iridescent with an array of white light representing a pattern similar to the integrated circuit of a computer. His ears were pointed like those of fictional elves, and he was wearing a costume made of silver as well, reminiscent of the nobility of who knows what kind of idiot king. He wore a puffy epaulette stitch, half-long trousers, moccasins and a pair of mismatched tights. A clownish individual, but one who in this place and these circumstances did not inspire the desire to laugh. Exulting from his smashing entrance, the silver jester greeted them with a perfect curtsy. "Greetings, my friends. My name is Aslael, but around here the players call me the instructor." He introduced himself in a twangy voice that Jake found horribly unpleasant. The Joker's smile was even more so, and made your bowels wag. This character looked like he had just been released from a psychiatric asylum. The other group was obviously thinking the same thing, since the Playboy was clutching his Colt so tightly that his knuckles were bleached. Instead of hiding from him, the rest of the group had slightly corrected their position to hide from the so-called instructor. Laughing at their reaction, the so-called Aslael burst into a crystalline laugh, which gave them the chills. At last, after almost a minute, he stopped laughing and sighed. Every time, it is the same old story. He exclaimed with a sorry look on his face. I don't understand how all these newcomers don't appreciate the extreme nobility of my appearance. Anyway, I guess I'll just explain the rules to them and go home. When Jake heard the word rules, he focused his attention back on the Silver Man's words. The word players had also caught his interest. The other group had obviously not noticed anything, still obsessed with their distrust of the newcomer, except for the businessman with glasses who was staring at the Silver Man with an extremely serious expression on his face. At least two here who seem to have their heads on their shoulders. Oh. Rank 1 authority. With a recruit here, it'll be easier, commented Aslael appreciatively, nodding happily to Jake and the man with the glasses. Since I have at least one person's attention and since we are not expecting anyone else, I'll get started. At that moment, even the few idiots who weren't listening came out of their torpor. First of all, welcome. Welcome aboard Planet B842, he said mischievously. If everyone didn't think much of it, Jake tilted at the word aboard. It was rather unwelcome, since it sounded like an invitation to a cruise rather than welcoming refugees whose planet had been stolen. Indeed, my words may be a little harsh. My bad. The instructor raved, raising a thumb in his direction, which sent a shiver down Jake's spine like never before. This silvery man could read his mind, an ability he had considered 2 minutes earlier to be mere fiction. He was prepared for it with the oracle, but it was still a surprise when it happened before him. As for the members of the other group, they looked puzzled, not understanding what the latter meant. To be perfectly frank, these planets are also called planet ships, that's what people in the mirror universe call them. The instructor said, this time in the serious tone of a teacher. Those of sufficient rank already know this, but this place where we are, absorbs many worlds simultaneously, from all kinds of universes. In doing so, this place is growing anarchically, giving birth to many planets like B842. Your Earth doesn't exist anymore. Seeing the dead fish expression of his audience, Aslael sighed heavily. That's why I hate welcoming newcomers, patient, and clearly not at his first speech, he tried a new approach. You are now in the mirror universe, a gigantic space filled with ether and planets like this one. Your home universe is one tiny little world among many. They form the dark universe, where the ether is sparse and the life forms primitive. What we call a world with a capital W, I insist, is the sum of the dark and mirror universe. Think of it as an egg. The yolk in the center is the dark universe, the white is the mirror universe. The closer you get to the shell, the more ether there is. What? Why not the other way around? Who cares? There are other eggs in the basket and we're not all friends. The digesters you may have had to deal with are from an egg laid by another hen. I'll stop the metaphor there. He seemed proud of his joke, but only a dead silence greeted him. Oh dear Oracle, I keep forgetting how painful it is to teach creatures with triple-digit IQs. Aslael lamented to the sky. He was sobbing now. Chapter 38 Aslael Part 2 You are listening at novelfull.audio. You were all tagged when you came in here. You have all received a gift. A line of etheric code. With it, you have a chance to survive and participate in the great epic that is life on planet B842. Aslael declared with a round of applause. At these words, Jake frowned. If the other group seemed lost, this information gave him some answers. He had indeed felt irrevocably changed from within when his apartment had shifted here. From what he had just heard, that was a good thing. It is a good thing, indeed. Aslael confirmed his mute conclusion, which again upset the other group, not understanding who he was addressing. If you don't understand poor souls, please raise your rank. I will only say what cannot be known otherwise. The jester complained wearily, feeling the toll on his mind after talking with these inferior monkeys for a few minutes. Since you're too dumb to sense the ether, there's no need to think about it. You'll realize soon enough that something has changed inside you. The oracle is a righteous being. If you are strong, it will not change your etheric code, but will simply correct your genetic defects. Any history of family illness? Good news for you, you won't have it. Of course, what is a genetic defect for you is not necessary one for the oracle. One of the balding man on the Playboy's side showed clear relief hearing that. Honestly, the scared and well-fed dude seemed like he had diabetes or hypertension, maybe both. If you're weak, on the other hand. At that moment, he stared at each member of the Playboy's gang one after the other, mischievously. Well, your etheric code has indeed changed. The good news is that it will help you survive here. The bad news is you have no control over it. Take this cat for example. Aslael said, pointing to Crunch who was taking a nap next to his owner. The gaze of the other humans changed when they noticed that this barbarian, covered in digester blood and armed to the teeth, was accompanied by a cute pet. Suddenly, he was not so scary anymore. Deep down, some of them almost assumed he was a trustworthy person. It is impossible for a cat to operate its oracle device efficiently. Most animals are given upon their arrival here an etheric code similar to that of the digesters. Simply by eating, they will become more massive and more efficient. On the other hand, they have little control over the morphological and psychological changes engendered. Etheric code is not genetic code, but the former can affect the latter, if the code is written in a way that enables it. Embedding complex etheric code is never without risk. The dead fish eyes had now given way to ghostly faces a revenant would not have disparaged. Sighing again, Aslael then pitifully explained everything Jake already knew about the ether and how to encode it to increase its attributes, breaking his promise to reveal only the minimum amount of information required. Hence the reason why the basic encoded ether that your oracle devices manufacture is preferable. The changes in your genetics and in your appearance are subtle. By checking your etheric or body status, you will realize that an increase in one does not significantly affect the other. But in the long run you will be different. Maybe taller, or heavier. With too much etheric imbalance, you may instead become too light or have an oversized skull or ears. No consequences are irreversible with the oracle's technology. But whether or not you can afford the price is an entirely different matter. For those who don't get it after all this explanation, this is what encoded ether looks like. As he said this, a red ring tattoo around his wrist lit up, and a filament of red light, emitting a deep sound, escaped from it and gushed into the palm of his hand. Suddenly, invisible pressure embraced the ether, compressing it to the point of looking like a tiny red star. A crystal about 2 millimeters in diameter floated from who knows where to the particle of light and merged with it, giving birth to a ruby-like jewel. This oracle representative had impressive telekinetic powers. And this is money. Aslael cried out, proud of his one-man show. The magic trick caused the 3 cowards in the other group to scream in surprise and horror. The little boy, on the other hand, was in awe. The Playboy, the 5 young women and the man with glasses didn't react, which confirmed his hypothesis that they had confronted a creature and thus seen his ether after its death. I told you we should have come closer after killing that filthy monster. The Playboy scolded the young women with a tone full of reproach. You couldn't have known it was beneficial. One of them, a blonde of 170 centimeters with a voluptuous chest and the shape of a model, tried to justify herself. Yes, you can. Jake sneered contemptuously in his head. What else was the AI of the Oracle for? That bug still killed half our class before you could take it down with your Colt. And without your gun, we probably wouldn't have made it. MMPFF, it doesn't matter, what's done is done. The Playboy sighed, visibly soothed by the thought of being acknowledged by these beautiful young women. What did the creature that attacked you look like? Interjected Jake, who was following the discussion attentively. His voice was hoarse, because he had lost the habit of communicating in the last 3 months. His only contacts were with she and his shadow guide, and they communicated mainly through thought. His deep voice surprised the playboy and his companions, but not the man with glasses, who answered. When we were taken here, we were in a shopping mall. Explained the man with the glasses, in a much softer voice, contrasting with Jake's. Only a fraction of the mall was washed away where we were, but there were more than 30 of us when we got here. After doing a little scouting, we spotted the blue beam and decided to go there. Unfortunately, halfway there a strange gray creature, the size of a big wolf, chased us. It was moving much faster than us and could change the shape of its forelimbs into different sharp objects. It killed about 10 people before Kyle managed to put a bullet in its head. But in the meantime, we lost the rest of the group, and if they didn't get here, I'm afraid they're dead. Your creature is different from the one that attacked me. Mine was bigger. Jake concluded, reasoning aloud with an analytical coldness that petrified the members of the other group. Bigger. With the size of a wolf, more than 10 people are dead. It's entirely possible. Aslael added, in an amused tone. Their distress seemed to make him happy. To be completely honest with you. Every living creature has its own set of bacteria, germs and parasites. A world, or if you prefer, an oracle is no exception. Seeing the explosion of thought in Jake's mind, the instructor realized he had made a blunder. Why? I spoke too much again. Aslael stammered, hiding his mouth with both hands like a tattletale caught revealing a secret. Well, these creatures you have met, we call them digesters. They are born spontaneously out of the dream ether that our world exhales and therefore make up the atmosphere of this place. The closer you get to the outer edge of the mirror universe, the higher the density of ether, so much so that for the moment your human bodies cannot survive it. Not because of the ether itself, but because of its effects on the physical laws that are magnified, including gravity. Ether density being low around here, you are unaware of its presence, and the digesters being born around here are small and fragile. Small and fragile. Everyone's expressions became sinister when Aslael uttered these words. Half their group had been decimated. Nevertheless, you are also breathing this ether right now, about twice as dense as on Earth. This is contributing to making you stronger. You will recover faster from your injuries, and assuming you survive by staying in this area, you have good chances of living 200 years. This passive ether does not appear in your status. Depending on where you are it fluctuates, and that ether is quickly lost if you return to a poorer place. B842 is at the entrance of the mirror universe, near the dark universe. This planet is so large that even if you moved at the speed of light for several years you couldn't make it full circle. In other words, here's my advice. Don't look for your loved ones, leave it to fate. Hearing this, Jake became slightly depressed. However, his depression was short-lived. He soon saw another, more promising solution. There is, of course, a way to find your friends. The instructor nodded appreciatively to Jake again. Become stronger and head for the Oracle cities or the cubes. So that brings me to the 3 futures that lie before you. Civilians, evolvers or players. Chapter 39 Civilian, Evolver and Player. You are listening at novelfull.audio. First of all, a first obvious point should be made. You've all been evolvers to some degree since the day an Oracle device merged with you. Aslael calmly disclosed. Also, even if you don't want to, you won't have a choice. Since by the very nature of the digesters we can't prevent them from spawning everywhere. Even if you were to stick your head in the sand, one of them might well appear in your own home. The 3 old scaredy cats kept shivering like they were suffering from a high fever. Those monsters were too terrifying. How could they fight those things? They were afraid of their own wives. A digester. There was no need to talk about it. Evolver simply means to actively pursue self-evolution, to become the best version of yourself. In that, the role of the Oracle device on your wrist has not changed. The jester reminded them, shrugging his shoulders. This naturally involves the accumulation of ether, which is also the only currency recognized in the mirror universe. A red crystal like the one I made in front of you is worth 10 kilos of gold here. I'm giving you this example as a comparison so that you may understand that choosing to avoid the risks associated with obtaining ether is tantamount to taking a long detour. Jake had no problem with that line of reasoning. Even if a man's passion or dream was to be a great painter, on a cosmic scale even that person would need ether to increase his intelligence, dexterity and perception to stand out. Even if a male or female model had such futile ambitions as being Miss or Mr. Mirror Universe, ether would be necessary to improve constitution and vitality. Skin texture, complexion, hair shine and so on were mainly dependent on metabolism and health. If you truly wish to escape conflict and put your life and destiny in the hands of other brave people willing to sacrifice themselves for your selfishness, there is a solution. Become a civilian. Aslael continued his explanation. To assist you during your stay on planet B842, a large number of Oracle shelters have been set up every 200 kilometers. These are the only places where digesters cannot spawn uncontrollably without paying the price. A hopeful look pervaded the three balding men as well as the middle-aged woman and her child. She hugged her son with wet eyes, relieved of enormous stress. However, we are back to the previous problematic. The price of the properties and rents are in ether, not to mention the entrance fee to the city. These shelters are rather large, but without ether you'll be sleeping in the streets. You will understand very quickly that apart from the ether, the rest is of little value. Barter exists, but it will only keep you alive for a while. One of the guys had totally lost it. His wobbly legs gave way, causing him to fall on his butt. The exhausted mother hugged her son again, hiding her despair from the child. Returning to the status of civilian, there is another piece of information I did not reveal. This planet has diplomatic immunity for the next 5 years. After that, B842 will become a subject of speculation and invasion by other species. You will become commodities with a price. You can already check your value in the Oracle store in the nearest city. Becoming a civilian without status or faction means that at the end of this period you lose all your rights. As the instructor threw bombs after bombs, the face of each interlocutor became more and more ugly. Even Jake was uncomfortable. He understood that despite Shi's benevolence, the bracelet under his skin was no different than a tracker for the Oracle, which transferred its data in real time. Nevertheless, there are ways to escape this dire fate. Aslael clearly knew how to play the carrot and the stick to keep them on their toes. The first, and I sense some of you will break into tears, is to redeem yourself. Just for the record, even a living hamster on B842 costs 500 red crystals or 500 units of purified ether. The Oracle has no use for slavery, but depriving a living being of freedom has a price. If you become someone else's slave, know that you probably didn't deserve the price he got you for. Aslael taunted them sardonically. Fuck you, Jake thought very hard in his head. I heard that. The jester laughed, not the least bit outraged. Anyway, these merchants are gentlemen. The problem is the others. Those who see you as ideal prey for the hunt, as a people to be eradicated or subjugated, they're the worst. So you have to ask yourself, how can you stand up to these alien evolvers who've had so many years to perfect themselves? 2 ways, which are interconnected. Increase your authority level or Oracle grade if you prefer, or become a player. For the first way, be aware that it is impossible to buy or obtain information about an individual with an Oracle grade higher than yours. Beyond rank 6 and as long as you perform your duties, you can no longer be bought and your territories and faction are under the protection of the Oracle. A civilian identified as being part of such a person's faction is also protected. That was what I meant when I said I would put your fate in the hands of others more worthy. The paradox is that this is somehow becoming someone else's servant. The coward seemed to be relieved again. Joining a faction simply meant reuniting with members of the Earth government. As long as the Earth government existed, they'd be safe. Aslael sneered as he read their minds, but he had seen trillions of similar individuals over his thousands of years. When hysterical fear took precedence over the will to evolve and make their way through this chaotic world, their fate was sealed. Only 3 or 4 seemed fit for the role of player. As for going far, only 2. And then we have the players. Aslael broke the silence again. You may not know it, but our world, the egg remember. The dark universe plus mirror universe, is at constant war with other worlds whose borders touch. For reasons far beyond your level of authority, these worlds compete with each other in a way that should be familiar to you. A game. Each of these worlds has an oracle and periodically they battle by sending troops into artificial sub-worlds created specifically for the occasion. These worlds created from scratch by the oracle are inspired by all the data drawn from the minds of the life forms under their jurisdiction. Simply put, we put you in a scenario you don't know anything about in advance and give you some goals. Scenarios, architecture, time, technology or magic may seem familiar to you in these worlds. After all, the oracle gets those ideas from all of you. Aslael clarified. It didn't seem that bad from Jake's perspective. He didn't quite grasp what these oracles were getting out of this little game they were playing. It doesn't matter what the oracle gets out of your efforts. What matters is what you do get out of it. The instructor replied in a playful tone. The oracle does not give rewards. That's what you've come to understand after all these months of familiarizing yourself with your bracelets, isn't it? The rewards offered by the coaching function are only what you naturally get for your efforts, right? Oracle ordeals are different. The better your performance, the better the final reward. When you find out about the real price of these ether rewards in an oracle store, you'll understand why so many choose to become players. These ordeals follow a sequence, with the difficulty increasing by 1 notch each time. The difficulty is based on ether's level. If you fail an ordeal, it's game over. If by some miracle you survive, you will be known and respected for the number of ordeals you have successfully completed. In the mirror universe, these accomplishments give you many passes. You should also know that as long as you are in the race with at least 1 successful ordeal, you are under the protection of the oracle as well. And lastly, the first 4 ordeals are considered a tutorial. You cannot lose your life and can even attempt the next ordeal after a failure. If with these conditions, you still want to be a miserable civilian, then maybe you are indeed no better than that. And this time, in saying these last words, Aslael exerted such an overwhelming spiritual pressure on them that it made no secret of the contempt he held for this kind of vermin. The weak had no place in the mirror universe.